In the mid-14th century, a shadow fell across Europe, a shadow invisible yet more lethal than any army or storm. It arrived without warning, carried along trade routes, ships, and dusty roads, moving silently through towns and villages. This shadow was the Black Death, a plague so fierce that it would claim the lives of millions, reshape societies, and leave an enduring mark on human consciousness. The streets of medieval towns, once bustling with merchants, children, and travelers, became eerily quiet. Doors were shuttered, markets abandoned, and the familiar rhythms of life fractured under the weight of fear. Survival in this age was a precarious dance between observation and adaptation. The plague did not strike uniformly. Some homes were spared, while others emptied within days. Humans, forced to confront an invisible enemy, quickly learned the value of careful observation. Families noticed patterns. Who fell ill first, which tradespeople seemed unharmed, and which environmental conditions coincided with outbreaks. Knowledge became a tool of life and death. Those who observed and adapted had a chance. Those who ignored the subtle signals often succumbed. Please subscribe if you are liking this video. Isolation became one of the first lessons in survival. Villages quarantined themselves, travelers were turned away, and infected households were sealed off. These measures were crude but effective. Simple acts, covering doors, burning straw, or leaving food outside for the sick, reduced exposure. Communities quickly realized that survival depended on both protecting the healthy and managing the care of the sick with caution. Distance was a shield, and observation a weapon. Food scarcity emerged alongside illness, with laborers dead or quarantined, fields went untended, markets emptied, and supply chains fractured. Humans adapted by foraging for wild plants, collecting nuts and berries, and relying on stored grains. Some villages pooled resources, rationing carefully to stretch meager supplies. Ingenious solutions arose: herbs for sustenance, root vegetables that could be preserved, and even the use of stored dried fruits as both food and medicine. Every small decision about food management could determine life or death. Psychological resilience became as important as physical protection. The fear of infection was paralyzing, yet communities had to maintain routines to survive. Families organized tasks, assigned roles, and structured the day to ensure that care, food gathering, and hygiene continued. Elders and religious leaders offered guidance and reassurance, framing survival as both a moral and practical endeavor. Calm, disciplined minds survived alongside healthy bodies. Observation extended to behavior and superstition. Some villagers believed that certain smells, rituals, or prayers could ward off the disease. While many practices were symbolic, they often had practical benefits. Keeping communities outdoors, maintaining fire smoke, and avoiding overcrowded spaces reduced the risk of contagion. Humans, blending observation, superstition, and trial and error, created survival strategies that balanced practical action with the comfort of ritual. Care of the sick demanded ingenuity. Infected individuals were isolated yet still needed food, water, and hygiene. Survivors developed methods to minimize contact while delivering essential care. Wooden sticks were used to hand over supplies, herbs were burned to purify the air, and makeshift beds were arranged to keep distance. Observation, improvisation, and cooperation became crucial, as a single misstep could result in infection and death. Cultural memory was preserved through oral storytelling. Tales of the plague's onset, survival strategies, and heroic deeds of caregivers spread across regions. These narratives encoded essential knowledge: how to isolate effectively, how to ration, and which behaviors seemed to reduce risk. They also reinforced psychological resilience, emphasizing courage, ingenuity, and moral duty. Through stories, the wisdom of one generation was passed to the next, ensuring that survival knowledge endured beyond the immediate crisis. Even in the darkest weeks, communities discovered resilience in cooperation. Sharing food, coordinating care, and maintaining hygiene practices were as vital as any physical shield. Social cohesion became both survival strategy and ethical imperative. Those who prioritized self-interest over communal welfare often fell first, while collaborative groups endured. Human ingenuity, empathy, and observation merged to create a web of life-sustaining actions in a world dominated by death. Survival during the Black Death was a multi-dimensional challenge: physical, mental, social, and ethical. Humans navigated fear, scarcity, and the relentless presence of death by observing patterns, adapting behavior, and sustaining cooperation. Those who survived did so not through luck alone, but through careful, deliberate strategies, blending empirical knowledge, cultural wisdom, and moral guidance. This first segment of the story lays the foundation for understanding the intricate ways in which humanity confronted one of history's deadliest pandemics. As the plague spread further into towns and countryside, the fabric of everyday life unraveled. Streets that once echoed with the laughter of children and the clatter of merchants became silent corridors of fear. Smoke rose from countless burning pyres, the stench of death mingling with that of rotting crops left untended. The air seemed heavy, not only with disease, but with despair, suspicion, and the faint whisper of panic. For survivors, every step outside their homes carried risk. Every interaction demanded caution and forethought. Survival required a delicate balance of mobility and avoidance, courage and prudence. Families clung together, forming small microcosms of order in an otherwise chaotic world. Parents observed their children constantly, ensuring that they did not stray into contaminated spaces. Elders instructed the young on which herbs could be eaten for sustenance, which streams of water appeared safest, and how to improvise basic hygiene in the absence of running water. Observation became a daily ritual, noting the patterns of illness within their own households, tracking which neighbors fell ill and which precautions seemed effective. Awareness was the first line of defense against the invisible enemy. Fear drove many to adopt extreme measures. Doors were barricaded, windows sealed, and travel abandoned. Yet isolation carried its own dangers. Food supplies dwindled quickly, and sickness could not be treated with modern medicine. Humans adapted by pooling resources with trusted neighbors, forming small survival clusters that balance protection from disease with access to sustenance. Observation guided these alliances, knowing who could be trusted, who adhered to sanitary practices, and who might carry infection-dictated survival strategies. Herbal knowledge became crucial. Leaves, roots, and flowers were collected, both for nourishment and for perceived medicinal value. Elderberries, yarrow, and sage were used in decoctions, sometimes boiled into broths or steeped in water for drinking. Certain herbs were hung in homes thought to purify the air. While medieval understanding of disease transmission was limited, these practices often had unintended benefits, encouraging cleanliness, reducing vermin, and keeping people outdoors rather than confined in unsanitary conditions. Observation and experimentation guided survival. The psychological burden was immense. People witnessed neighbors, friends, and family fall suddenly ill, their bodies wasting within days. Panic could spread faster than the plague itself. Communities developed coping mechanisms, structured routines, religious observances, communal prayers, and storytelling. Ritual and routine created a mental framework, allowing individuals to maintain focus and endurance. Emotional survival became intertwined with physical survival. A mind paralyzed by fear often succumbed first. Merchants and travelers were vectors of both goods and disease. Ports and crossroads became perilous. Travelers were scrutinized or outright barred entry. Trade routes fractured, forcing communities to become self-reliant. Observation and adaptability determined which routes were safe, which supplies could be trusted, and which alliances could sustain them. Strategic planning, choosing when to venture out, what to transport, and who to contact, was critical to maintaining a semblance of normal life. Religious interpretation shaped behavior and survival strategies. Many believed the plague was divine punishment, leading to rituals of penance, flagellation, or processions. While some practices were physically dangerous, others inadvertently reinforced protective measures. Processions often kept people outdoors, reducing indoor crowding. Fasting and purification rituals sometimes promoted cautious eating and hygiene. Communities blended spiritual beliefs with practical observation, creating adaptive responses that increased survival odds. Communities that survived the longest often combined observation, innovation, and cooperation. Makeshift hospitals were created to isolate the sick, food-sharing networks maintained sustenance, and young members were trained in basic care practices. Families documented effective strategies, which were passed orally or through simple writing systems to neighboring villages. Knowledge became cumulative, building a network of survival practices that spread beyond individual households to entire regions. Even small acts of care could determine outcomes, delivering a bowl of broth without direct contact, cleaning bedding while maintaining distance, and tending to wounds with simple herbal remedies all increased survival odds. Every individual became a critical agent in a larger survival strategy, their decisions reverberating through families, neighborhoods, and villages. Cooperation was no longer optional, it was the essence of life itself. Ultimately, survival during the early months of the Black Death was a combination of observation, adaptability, and resilience. Humans learned to navigate fear, ration scarce, resources care for the sick, and maintain social cohesion despite constant loss. Each day survived was a testament to human ingenuity, a delicate orchestration of practical knowledge, cultural tradition, and ethical commitment. The plague reshaped life, but those who endured left behind lessons of endurance, cooperation, and the unyielding will to live. As the months dragged on, the plague's grip tightened, and Europe's familiar rhythms vanished. Markets lay deserted, fields were left untended, and the sound of church bells, once signaling celebration or daily routine, now told a mournful warning of death. Entire families disappeared overnight, leaving homes empty and streets eerily silent. For survivors, the world transformed into a labyrinth of danger and uncertainty. Each day demanded careful observation, strategic planning, and relentless attention to both physical and psychological survival. Communities quickly realized that knowledge of the environment could save lives. Rivers and wells were monitored for cleanliness, as stagnant water or contaminated sources increased vulnerability to secondary illnesses. Open spaces were preferred over crowded indoor areas. Windows were kept open to improve airflow, and smoke from fires was used to disinfect and repel pests. Even when understanding of disease transmission was limited, human observation created practical protective measures. Survival depended on seeing patterns where none were immediately obvious. Food scarcity became a constant struggle. Fields abandoned due to illness led to a shortage of staples like wheat, barley, and vegetables. Livestock succumbed to disease or starvation, while trade networks collapsed under quarantine and fear. Humans adapted by foraging for wild foods. Nuts, berries, roots, and edible leaves became essential. Creativity extended to preserving what little remained, drying grains, storing roots in cool cellars, and fermenting fruits to extend their lifespan. Communities that successfully combined rationing, foraging, and preservation survived longer. Psychological endurance was continuously tested. The sight of death everywhere, coupled with uncertainty about infection, bred anxiety and despair. Families developed structured routines to maintain focus, daily chores, tending gardens, and small acts of mutual care. Storytelling and oral traditions helped maintain morale, transmitting survival knowledge while reinforcing hope. Music, prayer, and ritual became tools to structure time and combat despair. Emotional survival was inseparable from physical survival. Those who retained clarity and calmness navigated danger more effectively. Observation of social behavior was critical. Some individuals ignored warnings, traveled recklessly, or hoarded resources, often falling victim to infection. Others learned to cooperate strategically, sharing food, assisting the sick, and maintaining cleanliness. Communities developed informal rules for interaction, limiting physical contact, organizing food distribution, and monitoring hygiene. Social intelligence became a core survival skill, as navigating relationships with both the healthy and the infected could mean the difference between life and death. Healing and medicinal knowledge became vital, even if only partially effective. Herbal remedies were used to alleviate symptoms: willow bark for fever, garlic to strengthen the immune system, and aromatic herbs to purify the air. Bloodletting and poultices were common, though often dangerous. Observation guided practice. Techniques that seemed to reduce suffering or prolong life were refined and shared. Each small success reinforced the importance of empirical learning amidst widespread uncertainty. Children and the elderly were the most vulnerable, yet the human instinct to protect them shaped survival strategies. Caregivers devised methods to limit exposure while ensuring nourishment and comfort. Makeshift cradles were positioned near the fire but away from crowded spaces. Elders who remained strong supervised both young and sick, teaching essential skills while shielding them from harm. Protecting the most vulnerable became a communal priority, integrating compassion with pragmatic survival. Spirituality and cultural practice reinforced resilience. The belief in divine oversight or protection gave people a psychological anchor. Rituals, prayers, and symbolic acts offered structure and comfort. Even when superstition mingled with observation, the outcomes could be protective. Avoiding gatherings, performing ablutions, and maintaining cleaner homes were encouraged, often reducing exposure to disease. Culture and survival became inseparable. Observation of the plague itself was critical. Survivors tracked patterns of spread, noting which homes fell first and which neighborhoods remained relatively untouched. Seasonal patterns, wind directions, and environmental cues informed behavior. Such careful observation allowed communities to make informed decisions: when to isolate, where to relocate temporarily, and how to allocate resources. Survival was a careful balance of vigilance, adaptation, and foresight. Ultimately, enduring, the Black Death demanded a holistic form of intelligence: physical, social, cultural, and emotional. Humans learned to observe patterns, ration resources, care for the vulnerable, maintain morale, and adapt rituals to sustain life. Survival was not random, it was the result of deliberate strategies, accumulated wisdom, and shared effort. Each day survived became a testament to human ingenuity, resilience, and the enduring will to live. The months wore on, and the plague's relentless advance carved deep scars across towns, villages, and countryside alike. Streets, once vibrant with commerce and chatter, had become winding corridors of silence. The smell of smoke from burned pyres, mixed with the decay of abandoned homes and unburied bodies, hung heavily in the air. Windows were shuttered, gates closed, and travelers were denied entry to even the smallest settlements. Every day, survivors faced the crushing reality that the world they had known, the marketplace, the church, the laughter of children, was gone, replaced by fear, suspicion, and the omnipresent shadow of death. Those who survived had learned early the importance of observation. Families carefully monitored their neighbors, noting who fell ill, the order in which households succumbed, and even subtle differences in the behaviors of individuals who remained healthy. The placement of homes near flowing water, the use of herbs to purify rooms, and the routines of daily hygiene became critical factors in survival. People discovered, sometimes by tragic trial and error, that remaining indoors entirely could be as dangerous as leaving the house. Observation extended beyond the self. It encompassed community, environment, and timing. Every action carried consequence. Food scarcity intensified the struggle. With laborers dead, fields untended, and markets empty, survivors scavenged forests, riverbanks, and the edges of abandoned fields. Children learned which roots could be boiled into a thick, bitter sustenance. Elders guided the collection of wild herbs, berries, and mushrooms. Preservation techniques were revived or improvised, grains dried on rooftops, fruits stored in cool cellars, and meats smoked or salted when possible. Community cooperation became essential. Sharing food ensured that no family went completely without, yet trust had to be carefully balanced against the risk of contagion. The psychological strain was pervasive. Every knock on the door, every cough from a neighbor, every unusual rash or swelling stirred dread. Families devised coping strategies, sometimes turning to ritual, sometimes to storytelling, to manage fear. Songs were sung while working in gardens or fetching water, prayers recited while rationing food or tending the sick. Even simple routines, like sweeping the hearth, cleaning utensils, or organizing household items, became anchors of sanity. Emotional resilience and physical survival were inseparable. The faltering mind often meant the faltering body. Observation of patterns extended to behavioral strategies. Survivors noted that avoiding crowded spaces reduced illness, that certain tradespeople who worked outdoors seemed less affected, and that those who maintained hygiene practices, even simple hand washing, were more likely to survive. Knowledge became codified into community rules. Keep windows open, burn aromatic herbs indoors, quarantine the sick, and avoid unnecessary contact. Over time, these rules evolved from trial and error to semi-structured communal practices. Human ingenuity, combined with observation and discipline, became a lifeline. The sick required extraordinary care. Those tasked with tending the afflicted had to balance compassion with self-preservation. Families improvised tools to limit contact, long sticks for delivering food, cloth barriers for tending wounds, and elevated beds to reduce proximity. Herbal remedies, some aimed at purifying the blood, others for fever or pain relief, were applied cautiously, guided by both observation and inherited knowledge. Even minor successes in these treatments reinforced careful habits and gave hope amidst despair. Survival demanded not only vigilance but ingenuity, creativity, and courage. Children were both a vulnerability and a hope. Parents taught them to observe, ration, and avoid contaminated areas, often through simple practical exercises disguised as games or chores. Elders instructed them on which plants could supplement meager food supplies, how to boil water safely, and the safest routes between fields and homes. In these moments, survival and education merged. The young became apprentices in the art of enduring disaster, ensuring the continuity of knowledge and experience. Cultural practices, even in fear, maintained cohesion. Religious rites, once crowded with celebrants, were adapted. Prayers were offered outdoors, rituals simplified, and processions spread across open spaces. Symbols of protection, charms, holy water, incense served a dual purpose, offering spiritual comfort while encouraging behavior that reduced exposure, like keeping distance from others or staying outdoors. Communities blended superstition, ritual, and empirical observation into survival strategies, reinforcing both morale and practical safety. Observation of the disease itself became central to survival. Families recorded patterns of spread, noting differences between rapid and slow-onset illness, which areas of town were most affected, and which precautions seemed effective. This experiential knowledge, shared orally or through simple notes, allowed communities to adjust strategies continuously. Isolation measures were refined, food sharing protocols improved, and hygiene practices adapted. Survival was dynamic, requiring constant vigilance, flexibility, and critical thinking. Despite the relentless death surrounding them, communities began to rediscover resilience. Neighborhoods formed rotating networks to care for the sick, share food, and monitor hygiene. Knowledge was transmitted carefully. When someone survived exposure, their methods were observed and copied. When someone fell, the lessons were recorded and shared. Humans learned that survival was not merely individual, it was collective. Cooperation, observation, and ethical responsibility became as important as herbs, food, or clean water. Ultimately, enduring the Black Death in this stage demanded a combination of intellect, compassion, and discipline. Survivors used observation to identify patterns, rationing to extend scarce resources, creativity to care for the sick, and cultural practices to maintain cohesion and morale. Each decision, no matter how small, contributed to the chance of survival. These months reinforced a profound truth: survival is never accidental. It is the product of vigilance, adaptation, and the human will to endure, even when the shadow of death seems unstoppable. As the plague pressed relentlessly across the European landscape, the survivors faced challenges that went far beyond the illness itself. The Black Death was not only a biological catastrophe, but a social and psychological one. Entire towns became ghostly remnants of their former selves, with empty houses, abandoned livestock, and crumbling infrastructure. Roads, once thronged with travelers, were overgrown or littered with the remains of those who had fallen mid-journey. For the living, every journey, every choice, carried the weight of mortality and demanded extraordinary awareness. Survival became an exercise in observation, strategy, and constant vigilance. One of the first realizations for survivors was that the plague did not spread uniformly. Neighborhoods, streets, and even individual houses could experience wildly different rates of infection. Families quickly began to track who was healthy and who was not, learning from both success and tragedy. Some discovered that moving slightly outside of heavily affected areas, even by a few hundred meters, could drastically reduce exposure. Observation became a life-saving skill. Those who paid attention to environmental cues, wind patterns, water flow, and population density gained a critical advantage. Food scarcity intensified in previously fertile regions. With laborers decimated and trade disrupted, staple crops rotted in the fields, and livestock wandered abandoned pastures. Communities became inventive in finding alternative sustenance. They foraged forests for nuts and wild berries, dug for roots, and identified edible herbs. Even urban survivors scavenged alleyways, abandoned granaries, or riverbanks for fish and waterfowl. Knowledge of local flora and fauna, often passed down through oral tradition, became crucial. Observation and experimentation guided what could safely be eaten, with mistakes sometimes proving fatal. Water access became equally critical. Wells, rivers, and cisterns were monitored for cleanliness. Observing which sources appeared less contaminated and which water collection methods reduced sickness was essential. Households boiled water when possible, collected rainwater, or devised simple filters using cloth and sand. Each improvement in water management represented a small but significant increase in survival odds. The interplay of observation, ingenuity, and adaptation was constant. Psychological endurance remained under assault. The continuous sight of death, coupled with the unpredictability of the disease, created chronic stress. Communities found ways to preserve mental health through structure, ritual, and social cohesion. Daily chores, shared responsibilities, storytelling, and simple songs provided focus. Religion and spirituality offered both explanation and solace. Prayers, processions, and protective charms were used to frame the unseen threat, creating a sense of control even when actual control was limited. Emotional resilience became inseparable from physical survival. The role of observation extended to human behavior. Survivors quickly learned to identify those who ignored precautions or broke social distancing measures. Risk was assessed not only by proximity to the sick, but by behavioral patterns, travel, hygiene, and interactions with multiple households. Trust was carefully calibrated. Alliances were based on shared knowledge, demonstrated prudence, and cooperation. Those who failed to respect communal rules often succumbed to the plague first, reinforcing the value of social intelligence as a survival tool. Caring for the sick required a delicate balance. Households developed methods to minimize exposure. While delivering necessary care, herbs were used both symbolically and practically, poultices were applied carefully, and meals were handed over with sticks or cloth barriers. Observing which techniques were most effective, which herbs seemed to alleviate symptoms, and which household arrangements reduced transmission became crucial knowledge. These strategies were refined through trial and error, with survivors documenting effective methods mentally or in written notes when possible. Children were both vulnerable and vital to the continuity of life and culture. Families taught them survival skills through practical exercises, identifying edible plants, observing safe routes, and assisting with care of the sick at safe distances. These lessons, embedded in routine tasks and often disguised as games, ensured that the next generation absorbed knowledge critical for enduring not only the current crisis, but potential future ones. Even in despair, humans prioritized continuity of life and knowledge. Cultural practices provided more than emotional comfort. They served as frameworks for survival. Rituals, prayers, and symbolic acts encouraged safe behaviors. Processions were held outdoors rather than in enclosed churches. Fasting or purification rites inadvertently promoted hygiene and careful food management. Communities blended observation, superstition, and empirical learning into practices that protected life. Humans learned to navigate fear, belief, and practicality, simultaneously creating adaptive strategies that sustained them physically and psychologically. Observation of the disease itself evolved. Survivors meticulously noted patterns of spread, recovery, and mortality. They identified which homes, streets, or neighborhoods were less affected, and which measures, distance, ventilation, isolation, provided protection. This empirical knowledge informed daily decisions: where to travel, which interactions were safe, and how to allocate resources. Survival was not random. It was earned through vigilance, learning, and careful adaptation to a constantly changing environment. By this stage, communities had begun to develop intricate networks for survival. Families coordinated care, food distribution, and information sharing. Successful strategies, herbal remedies, quarantine methods, and protective rituals were passed from household to household. Observing those who survived repeated exposure offered lessons in resilience, hygiene, and practical wisdom. Humans relied on cooperation, ethical behavior, and strategic thinking as much as on physical strength or knowledge of herbs. Ultimately, survival during this phase of the Black Death required a holistic integration of observation, adaptation, psychological endurance, social intelligence, and cultural wisdom. Each day was a delicate negotiation between fear and action, isolation and cooperation, tradition and experimentation. The survivors were not merely lucky, they were adaptive, vigilant, and resilient. Their experiences shaped not only immediate survival, but also the enduring wisdom that would be transmitted for generations. Life persisted, fragile yet determined, amidst a landscape scarred by death. As the plague persisted, survivors began to adapt not only to immediate threats, but also to the longer-term realities of life in a world transformed. Cities that had once thrived on commerce and social interaction now faced structural collapse, with markets empty, workshops silent, and homes abandoned. The rhythm of daily life had been irrevocably altered, and those who remained were forced to develop strategies that went beyond simple survival. They had to rebuild routines, maintain morale, and ensure the continuity of knowledge for future generations. Observation remained the cornerstone of survival. Survivors meticulously documented the progression of the disease within their own households and communities. They noted which patterns of isolation, hygiene, and interaction correlated with survival. Those who recovered or remained uninfected became sources of invaluable information. Families observed neighbors, recorded small victories over illness, and adapted practices to replicate success. This careful attention to patterns transformed fear into actionable knowledge, providing a framework for strategic decision-making. Food scarcity continued to challenge communities. With laborers dead and trade networks disrupted, surviving households relied on a combination of stored grains, foraging, and improvisation. They learned to identify edible plants previously considered secondary or wild, to preserve roots and tubers for months, and to ration staples meticulously. Cooperation became crucial. Groups pooled resources, rotated tasks to reduce exposure, and organized communal gardens and livestock pens where possible. Strategic observation of both resources and human behavior allowed communities to survive in a precarious, resource-scarce environment. Water and sanitation were also critical. Survivors observed that stagnant or polluted sources contributed to illness, leading to careful selection of wells, streams, and rainwater collection. Cloth filters, boiling, and other improvised methods were employed to reduce risk. Waste management became a practical concern. Contaminated areas were avoided, and corpses were carefully buried or burned when possible. Observation of environmental cues, the color of water, the presence of insects, or the smell of air, guided behavior and informed choices that directly impacted survival. The psychological toll was immense. Grief, fear, and the omnipresence of death threatened to overwhelm the living. Survivors developed strategies to maintain mental stability. Routines, small tasks, and shared responsibilities became essential. Storytelling, songs, prayers, and rituals provided structure and a sense of continuity. These practices offered psychological resilience, creating a mental scaffold upon which individuals could navigate chaos. Emotional endurance became inseparable from physical survival. A calm, focused mind allowed for better observation, planning, and decision-making. Caring for the sick required ingenuity and courage. Families devised methods to reduce exposure while providing care. Long sticks for delivering food, elevated beds to limit proximity, and protective coverings made from cloth or herbs. Herbal remedies were carefully applied, and the effectiveness of each intervention was observed and noted. The interplay of observation, experimentation, and communication became a lifeline. Small acts of care, an herbal poultice, a warmed broth, or a carefully disinfected bed could mean the difference between life and death. Children and the elderly demanded special attention. Families trained the young to recognize safe practices, identify edible plants, and assist in household survival without increasing risk. Elders, when healthy, became repositories of practical and cultural knowledge, teaching survival strategies, oral history, and ethical lessons to ensure continuity. Protecting and educating these vulnerable groups reinforced the survival of both physical life and cultural identity. Spirituality and ritual played a dual role. Religious beliefs provided comfort and community structure, while ritualized behavior often coincidentally promoted safety. Processions were moved outdoors, prayers encouraged careful behavior, and symbolic acts reinforced observation and discipline. Survivors learned to integrate spiritual practices with empirical observation, creating adaptive strategies that supported both psychological resilience and practical survival. Observation of social networks became increasingly sophisticated. Survivors identified which alliances, families, or neighborhoods offered reliable cooperation and which were risky. Knowledge of who followed hygiene rules, respected isolation protocols, or provided food and support became critical. Strategic cooperation was cultivated, allowing for the creation of survival networks that balance protection with the pooling of resources and knowledge. Ethical behavior, caring for others while maintaining personal safety, became central to long-term survival. By this stage, communities began to rebuild not only daily routines but social cohesion. Rotating networks for food distribution, communal care, and mutual observation became standard. Stories of survival, both practical and moral, were shared widely. Techniques for isolation, hygiene, and herbal care were codified in oral and sometimes written form. Knowledge, passed carefully, became cumulative, creating a growing body of survival wisdom that would endure beyond the immediate crisis. Ultimately, this phase of the Black Death demonstrated the holistic nature of human survival. It was not enough to avoid infection. Survivors needed observation, adaptability, psychological resilience, cooperation, cultural continuity, and ethical decision-making. Each day survived required careful calculation, continuous learning, and moral courage. Through these strategies, humans did not merely endure, they adapted, rebuilt, and ensured the continuity of life and knowledge, even in the shadow of overwhelming death. As the immediate waves of the plague began to ebb in some regions, survivors were left to contend, not only with the physical devastation, but with the profound social and cultural aftermath. Entire towns had been depopulated, familiar streets were littered with the remnants of life abruptly interrupted. Families that had survived were fractured, some members gone, others permanently scarred by trauma. Yet within this desolation, human ingenuity, resilience, and the drive to endure persisted. Survival had shifted from mere physical endurance to the rebuilding of communities, culture, and knowledge. Observation remained the cornerstone of recovery. Survivors meticulously recorded what had allowed them to live, which precautions prevented infection, which sources of food and water were safe, and which practices had strengthened psychological resilience. Families, often through oral storytelling, conveyed this knowledge to younger generations. Children learned not only about plants, herbs, and survival techniques, but also about moral responsibility, social cohesion, and the importance of communal care. Every lesson learned during the crisis became a tool for future security. Food and resource management took on new dimensions. Fields had to be replanted, livestock tended, and trade slowly re-established. Observation of soil quality, seasonal cycles, and weather patterns informed decisions about planting and harvesting. Communal efforts were vital, labor was pooled, irrigation systems repaired, and shared gardens cultivated. People learned to ration carefully while experimenting with alternative crops, wild foods, and preservation methods. The blending of traditional knowledge with new strategies forged a resilient agricultural foundation that could withstand future shocks. Water and sanitation became more than survival tools. They became pillars of rebuilding. Survivors cleaned wells, established new water sources, and created basic waste management systems. Observation informed placement of homes, livestock pens, and communal areas. Communities developed rules about the use of water, disposal of waste, and avoidance of contamination. The lessons of observation and adaptation honed during the crisis were applied systematically to create safer, more resilient living environments. Psychological resilience was equally crucial. The trauma of watching neighbors, friends, and family perish could have left survivors paralyzed with fear. Instead, many communities rebuilt routines, reinstated work, and revived cultural and religious practices. Ritual, music, and storytelling provided a framework for emotional recovery, while practical tasks, gardening, construction, care of the young, offered purpose and structure. Human endurance was expressed not only through survival, but through the reconstruction of normalcy. Social intelligence and cooperation continued to be vital. Families, neighborhoods, and towns carefully assessed who could be trusted in resource sharing, care networks, and rebuilding efforts. Cooperation that had been essential during the height of the plague became equally important in reconstruction. Social observation allowed communities to identify leaders, skilled workers, and reliable allies, ensuring that communal efforts were efficient and effective. Ethical behavior, fairness, empathy, and mutual assistance remained central to survival in a post-plague world. Cultural preservation emerged as a core aspect of survival. Survivors recognized that knowledge, stories, and traditions were as valuable as food or water. Oral histories recorded who had survived, how they had done so, and what lessons could guide future generations. Songs, proverbs, and tales encoded practical advice about hygiene, resource management, and risk avoidance. Religious rituals and communal ceremonies reinforced shared identity and collective resilience, reminding communities that they had endured together and could face future challenges as a unit. Observation of the environment continued to guide long-term adaptation. Survivors monitored seasonal cycles, river patterns, and agricultural conditions to optimize planting and harvest schedules. Communities that carefully observed rainfall, temperature variations, and natural resources were better positioned to prevent future famine or resource scarcity. This integration of empirical observation with cultural knowledge created a durable system for resilience. Education became a priority for survival beyond immediate physical needs. Children and apprentices were taught skills critical for maintaining food production, hygiene, and care for the vulnerable. Knowledge about herbs, safe water practices, and basic medical interventions was passed down deliberately. Elders ensured that both practical and ethical lessons, cooperation, responsibility, and empathy were transmitted. In this way, survival extended beyond those immediately present, embedding wisdom into the next generation. Ultimately, the aftermath of the Black Death demonstrated that survival was not only about enduring death, but about rebuilding life. Communities that observed carefully, adapted creatively, maintained psychological resilience, and preserved culture were able to re-establish themselves. Knowledge, cooperation, and vigilance became cumulative, forming a foundation that would influence society for centuries. Humanity's will to live manifested not only in individual endurance, but in the reconstruction of communities, culture, and shared wisdom, an enduring testament to resilience in the face of overwhelming mortality. As the plague gradually receded, Europe was left transformed. Cities and towns bore the marks of death, abandonment, and fear. Yet from this devastation emerged the remarkable endurance of human life and culture. Survivors were no longer merely enduring the plague, they were rebuilding civilization itself. The lessons learned during those dark years through observation, adaptation, cooperation, and resilience shaped the social, cultural, and medical trajectory of Europe for centuries. The immediate priority for communities was reconstruction. Homes that had stood empty for months required repair. Fields once tilled lay fallow, and livestock needed careful management. Observation remained central. Those who survived understood which areas had remained safer, which crops were resilient, and which practices in hygiene, food storage, and water management had mitigated risk. Knowledge gathered during the height of the plague informed every decision, guiding labor allocation, crop selection, and community organization. Communities also had to adapt socially. Population loss had left gaps in leadership, labor, and care systems. Survivors quickly reorganized, often with new social hierarchies emerging based on practical skill, resilience, and ethical conduct during the crisis. Those who had demonstrated courage, innovation, or reliable judgment were recognized as leaders guiding rebuilding efforts. Social observation, critical thinking, and moral behavior had become essential survival tools, translating directly into influence and responsibility. In the post-plague world, food security remained a priority. Agricultural practices were refined, incorporating lessons learned during the plague, crop rotation, diversified planting, and careful monitoring of soil and water conditions. Communities created shared storage systems, rationing protocols, and foraging strategies to ensure sustainability. Observational knowledge, carefully transmitted across households, became a practical guide for future crises, embedding resilience into everyday life. Medical understanding evolved slowly but meaningfully. The catastrophic loss of life forced humans to reconsider treatments, hygiene, and environmental management. Herbal remedies, isolation practices, and observations of disease patterns contributed to early empirical medicine. Even incorrect theories, when applied thoughtfully, often reduced risk or alleviated suffering. Knowledge gained from careful observation, experimentation, and communal learning laid the groundwork for more systematic medical approaches in the centuries to follow. Psychological resilience and cultural continuity became intertwined. Survivors used storytelling, ritual, and communal reflection not only to preserve memory, but to reinforce coping mechanisms. Narratives of courage, ingenuity, and cooperation during the plague were passed down through generations, encoding lessons of survival in both practical and ethical terms. Music, prayer, and oral histories preserved morale while transmitting vital knowledge. Culture itself became a survival tool, guiding behavior and sustaining hope. Education of children became a deliberate and strategic effort. The lessons of observation, hygiene, care, and resource management were formalized into everyday practice. Elders acted as teachers, transmitting both practical skills, herbal knowledge, water purification, basic care techniques, and ethical lessons, compassion, cooperation, and responsibility. Survival had become an integrated system, encompassing mind, body, and society, with knowledge deliberately passed forward to safeguard future generations. Human ingenuity was evident in daily life. Survivors invented practical tools, long-handled instruments for food delivery, protective coverings for caregivers, improved storage containers, and ventilation systems to reduce contagion. Observation of successful strategies, combined with trial and error learning, created an adaptive culture of survival. Even small improvements, better hygiene, safer water, more efficient food storage, translated directly into prolonged life and greater resilience. Perhaps most profoundly, the Black Death illustrated the cumulative power of human knowledge and cooperation. Survival was not the result of chance alone, but of careful observation, adaptation, and ethical behavior. Communities that monitored their environment, cooperated with neighbors, protected the vulnerable, and preserved cultural knowledge thrived more effectively than those that did not. These lessons shaped not only immediate survival but also social structures, medicine, agriculture, and cultural memory for generations. In the aftermath, humanity had learned enduring truths. Observation could reveal invisible threats, adaptation could overcome scarcity, cooperation amplified resilience, and culture and storytelling could preserve the lessons of survival. Individuals had learned to endure fear, to act ethically under pressure, and to integrate practical knowledge with moral guidance. The Black Death was not merely a story of death, it was a story of extraordinary human perseverance, ingenuity, and the relentless will to survive. Even centuries later, the echoes of survival during the Black Death persisted. Modern medicine, hygiene practices, social cooperation, and cultural continuity all bear traces of these experiences. Humans learned that survival is multidimensional, requiring attention to physical, mental, social, and ethical dimensions of life. The lessons of this era, recorded in stories, rituals, and practical wisdom, ensured that future generations could endure challenges of both nature and society with insight and resilience. The Black Death ultimately revealed the indomitable spirit of humanity. Through fear, loss, and uncertainty, people observed, adapted, cared, and persevered. Communities rebuilt, knowledge accumulated, and culture endured. Life survived, fragile yet determined, illuminating the profound truth that even in the darkest shadows, human ingenuity, resilience, and cooperation could triumph over devastation. The story of survival during the plague is a testament to the enduring power of the human will, a lesson in endurance, adaptation, and hope that continues to resonate across centuries. Even as the immediate devastation of the Black Death waned, survivors faced a new challenge, living in a world where everything familiar had been irrevocably altered. Villages and towns were depopulated, trade networks disrupted, and societal hierarchies upended. The loss of labor forced people to adopt new roles, often outside traditional social structures. Children assumed responsibilities previously held by adults. Women managed farms, workshops, and households on unprecedented scales. Observation, adaptability, and resilience became daily necessities, shaping not only survival, but the evolution of society itself. Communities turned to meticulous observation of both environment and social networks. Individuals learned to monitor changes in vegetation, river levels, and livestock health, understanding that small ecological shifts could have life or death consequences. Social observation was equally critical. Trust, reliability, and past behavior determined alliances for resource sharing, caregiving, and protection. Households that applied careful observation to both human and environmental factors navigated scarcity and danger far more successfully than those relying on chance. Food security remained a pressing concern. Fields abandoned during the plague needed replanting, but labor shortages limited cultivation. Survivors experimented with crop rotation, planting alternative grains, legumes, and hardy vegetables to maximize yield. Wild foraging supplemented diets, while preservation methods, smoking, salting, drying, ensured food lasted through harsh seasons. Communities that observed environmental cues like soil fertility, rainfall, and frost patterns adapted planting strategies accordingly, creating a flexible, resilient food system. Water management was critical to prevent secondary disease outbreaks. Survivors dug new wells, diverted streams, and devised filtration systems using cloth, sand, or ash. Observation of water quality, smell, clarity, presence of algae or insects became a skill passed down to children and apprentices. Waste management strategies were also refined. Designated areas for human and animal waste, careful disposal of contaminated items, and burning of debris reduced risk and supported long-term survival. Psychological resilience became a survival tool. Communities reinstated structured daily routines using repetitive tasks, shared responsibilities, and small celebrations to maintain focus and morale. Storytelling, music, and prayer reinforced social bonds, helping individuals process grief while fostering hope. Survivors learned to balance fear and action, understanding that panic weakened both mind and body. Mental fortitude was intertwined with practical survival. A vigilant, calm mind enabled careful observation and timely adaptation. Caring for the sick remained a central concern, even as traditional medical knowledge proved limited. Families and neighbors developed protocols, isolation rooms, protective coverings, and minimal contact combined with careful observation of symptoms. Herbal remedies were tested, with meticulous notes passed through generations. Those who survived multiple exposures became teachers, their experiential knowledge forming a foundation for evolving medical practices. Observation, experimentation, and record-keeping became essential survival tools. Education of the young was redefined by necessity. Children learned practical skills, agriculture, herbology, hygiene, and caregiving through hands-on experience. Ethical lessons, cooperation, empathy, responsibility were integrated into daily tasks. Elders prioritized transmission of knowledge, not just for immediate survival but for the resilience of future generations. In this way, the Black Death transformed education into a survival mechanism. Cultural continuity was deliberately preserved. Oral histories, songs, and communal storytelling reinforced shared memory and identity. Communities maintained rituals, adapted to post-plague realities. Outdoor prayers, seasonal festivals, and protective charms reinforced both psychological comfort and practical safety. Observation of past mistakes guided adaptation. Streets were cleaned, water monitored, and isolation measures applied when necessary. Knowledge and culture became intertwined instruments of survival. The Black Death reshaped the social fabric. Labor shortages elevated the value of skilled workers, changed economic relationships, and altered social hierarchies. Communities that observed these changes and adapted their strategies through cooperation, resource management, and careful monitoring of social networks thrived. Ethical behavior, collective responsibility, and vigilance became as crucial as physical endurance or medicinal knowledge. Survival had evolved into a complex, multi-layered system combining observation, adaptation, and social intelligence. By the end of this phase, humanity had transformed. The plague had destroyed life on an unprecedented scale, yet it also illuminated the extraordinary capacity for adaptation, learning, and cultural resilience. Those who endured had not only survived the disease itself, but had acquired lessons in observation, resourcefulness, cooperation, and ethical responsibility. They left a legacy of knowledge that would inform generations, creating a foundation for the future of human civilization. As years passed after the peak of the Black Death, survivors confronted the ongoing reality of a world permanently altered. Towns and villages were slowly repopulated, yet the social, economic, and psychological effects of the plague endured. Life became a careful balancing act. Humans needed to maintain vigilance, safeguard scarce resources, and integrate lessons learned into daily routines to prevent future catastrophes. Observation, experimentation, and cooperation remained central to all survival strategies. Communities that flourished were those that institutionalized knowledge gained during the crisis. Families and neighborhoods developed routines for hygiene, food storage, and caregiving. Observation guided improvements, tracking which crops thrived, which water sources remained safe, and which social practices reduced conflict or disease spread. This meticulous attention created resilient systems that could withstand future crises, whether environmental, social, or biological. Food security became both a practical and moral endeavor. With labor shortages, survivors devised shared cultivation practices, communal storage systems, and rotational planting to maximize yield. Wild foraging complemented agriculture, with meticulous observation ensuring safe and nutritious collection. Techniques learned during the plague, root preservation, grain storage, and fermentation were applied more systematically, creating a culture of strategic resource management. Communities that monitored environmental cues and adapted practices survived more effectively. Water management and sanitation remained pillars of survival. Wells were monitored, streams diverted for safety, and filtration systems refined. Observation extended to recognizing environmental signals. Algae blooms, stagnant pools, or foul odors indicated contamination. Waste management protocols were formalized, ensuring that both human and animal waste were contained. These practices reduced disease risk, highlighting the critical interplay between environmental observation and long-term survival. Psychological endurance was reinforced through structure and ritual. Survivors integrated work, prayer, communal meals, and storytelling into daily life, creating routines that mitigated fear and reinforced resilience. Music, festivals, and shared labor fostered morale, while oral histories reinforced lessons of survival, cooperation, and ethical responsibility. Mental fortitude became inseparable from practical survival. Communities that cultivated hope alongside vigilance thrived. Cultural preservation was a deliberate act. Stories of courage, ingenuity, and collective action during the plague were passed down orally and eventually recorded in writing. These narratives served both as ethical instruction and practical guidance, encoding lessons about hygiene, isolation, resource management, and cooperation. Rituals adapted to post-plague realities reinforced both communal identity and survival strategies, ensuring that knowledge persisted across generations. Observation of human behavior remained critical. Survivors monitored who adhered to communal rules, shared resources, and contributed to rebuilding efforts. Social intelligence became a survival skill. Trust, reliability, and cooperation were carefully evaluated, and alliances formed accordingly. Communities recognized that survival depended not only on individual resilience, but also on ethical engagement with others. Compassion and responsibility became as vital as physical endurance. Medical knowledge evolved incrementally. Herbal remedies, quarantine practices, and rudimentary observations of disease transmission formed a growing empirical base. Those who survived multiple exposures shared techniques, creating informal networks of knowledge. Observation, experimentation, and documentation gradually transformed survival tactics into proto-medical understanding, laying the groundwork for future advances. Education of the young continued to integrate practical and ethical lessons. Children learned skills essential for life, agriculture, hygiene, caregiving, while also absorbing lessons in cooperation, responsibility, and community stewardship. Survivors understood that the continuity of knowledge was essential to prevent future catastrophes. Observation, experimentation, and cultural memory were deliberately transmitted to ensure enduring resilience. By the end of this period, human society had adapted profoundly. The Black Death had tested every dimension of survival: physical, psychological, social, and cultural. Communities that observed carefully, collaborated effectively, and preserved knowledge were able to rebuild and thrive. Those lessons, hard-won through suffering and meticulous observation, became embedded in human civilization, demonstrating the extraordinary resilience of the species. Survival during the Black Death was thus not merely a matter of luck. It was the result of observation, adaptation, cooperation, and moral courage. The human capacity to endure, innovate, and preserve knowledge ensured that even in the face of overwhelming mortality, life persisted, culture survived, and civilization was renewed.